Okay, so as some of you know because you are in the workshop, currently on Friday afternoons, I have a group of people who are working in the special topic spring sculpture session. And there's part one and part two to this workshop. Part one is working from observation, working from the model in clay, much like what you see in this image here. This is me working on a sculpture. There's the model. And so part two of the workshop is a movement into abstraction, where we explore ideas of sculptural abstraction using the head as a point of departure. So in that, with that group of students, we're about to move into abstraction after having spent 4 days with the model. And so this talk is meant to be a bit of a launching point for that next move. So when one thinks about the pursuit of working from the model, working observationally from a model, they tend to think of this type of result, right? And in the class, we've looked at this, an image of this sculpture. It's a sculpture by the 19th century French artist Houdon, and it's a portrait of Voltaire, and the likeness is in fact remarkable, and the naturalism is in fact also remarkable. And so, you know, when people think of this type of sculpture, they think of these terms real and realistic, right? And so I'm going to talk about these terms, real and realistic, in relationship to the term of abstract or abstraction. And so we're going to think about where the edges of those terms lie in relationship to art. And so one point I want to make now, and I'll say more about it later, is that if one thinks of this sculpture here, the Houdon sculpture, as real or realistic, then one at least partially denies the fact that it requires understanding of abstract sculptural vocabulary to achieve these effects. So I'll say more about that eventually. So most people, when they think about some distinction between realistic and abstract in the world of painting or sculpture, they think of this type of distinction. They think of Houdon sculpture as realistic. They think of Tom Cruise's portrait here as realistic. And then they think of something like this as being abstract. There's no doubt that there is some inherent difference between these things, right? However, I want to suggest that it's a little too simplistic to differentiate between these things as simply saying one is realistic and one is abstract. So as an artist and as a teacher, I've come across people talking about or using these words in conversation about art, and some of the common usages of these terms that bug me a little bit, that get me thinking about putting together presentations like this, are comments like, I prefer abstract, or I want to make it abstract, or I do abstracts, or I want to learn how to do abstract, or my kid could do abstract, I'm not impressed. On the other hand, in relationship to real or realistic, I hear things like, wow, that is so real, it looks like a photograph. Or, I want to learn how to make it more real, when they're talking about their work of art. Or one might say, he or she is a realist artist. And so again, these phrases, for me, are too simplistic, because they imply a naivete about certain very important concerns relative to, very essential concerns, essential if one is going to be at all sophisticated when looking at art or making art. I want to disclose the fact that I am a little bit unusual in the sense that when I look at these three sculptures, this is a Ron Mueck sculpture. Some of you might be familiar from him, or of him from a show he had at the Fort Worth Modern a couple years back. Might even have been 5 years by now. But this is a Michelangelo sculpture, and this is a Mesoamerican sculpture from the DMA that I am particularly fond of. And so most people, if you ask them to put these sculptures in order from one being realistic, the most realistic, to three being the least realistic, they would say, well, clearly, without a doubt, this is the most realistic sculpture. And then probably Michelangelo's David is close behind, and far behind in terms of realistic is this Mesoamerican sculpture here. So to give you a little bit of a sense of where I'm coming from, and maybe more than anything to give you something to just chew on, I would actually reverse that order. For me, this sculpture is the least realistic when I stand in front of it. This is far more realistic, but still not as realistic as this sculpture here. So how could that be? What the heck is he talking about? What I'm talking about is that even though this sculpture here, Ron Mueck is, he's one of these, he's classified as maybe a hyper-realist sculptor. And what that means is he uses all of the latest and greatest special effects techniques to create body casts of actual people, and then he painstakingly paints them with incredible detail, and he like inserts hairs, real hairs, into the surface of the thing. And he even like puts these funny materials on the surface that are made in China. They use them to make fake food samples to put in restaurants. This stuff that makes it look like there's maybe sweat on the surface of the body or some other sort of bodily fluid. And yet, when I stand in front of these sculptures, the Ron Mueck sculptures, for me they're incredibly plastic. And I don't mean plastic in the way that the term used to be used in relationship to sculpture. I mean plastic like dollar store plastic. I mean, they're quite impressive, and they're very well done for what they are. But there's this plastic quality that feels so cold in relationship to, or in comparison to, the experience I have when I stand in front of another person and engage them. The Michelangelo, standing in front of that sculpture, it has much more of a presence than this sculpture. Part of it has to do with the fact that the thing is huge, right? It's very, very monumental in size. And so that adds to its presence. But it's also dynamic in other ways. This little guy, it's a tiny little sculpture. It's about 8 inches tall. For me, when I say this is the most real, what I mean by that is when I stand in front of this thing, there's a tremendous presence that it has. It's not the same as standing in front of a human being, but in terms of quantity of presence, if you can quantify such a thing. For me, this thing has a tremendous amount of presence, and it has to do with, among other things, it has to do with the fullness of these forms. And this compressed vertical axis in relationship to this expanding horizontal axis. It even has to do with the quirky fact that these arms seem to have 2 elbows or 3 sections to them. The patterning, the coloration, the expression on the face in relationship to these patterns, all of that for me adds up to a whole lot of presence. And so, that's not, I don't expect all of you to have that experience, but I think it's a good thing for you to think about the fact that someone who makes sculpture and teaches sculpture and studies sculpture and just thinks nonstop about sculpture, what does it mean that I would say that? Now, either I'm a whack job, or I'm tapped into something that's actually there. So going forward, unfortunately, we don't have time to talk about these ideas of realism or realistic versus abstract in relationship to painting. We're going to focus on sculpture. And so a lot of the concepts will apply to painting, and I know a lot of you make paintings, but we're going to focus on sculpture for the most part. So what is abstraction? First, I want to consider the dime store art historian view of this question. This is my term, the dime store art historian. It's, you find the dime store art historian view on websites like dictionary.com. And so on dictionary.com, you'll find the definition that abstract art is a trend in painting and sculpture in the 20th century. Right? So it isolates this idea of art that is abstract is, isolated in the 20th century. Abstract art seeks to break away from traditional representation of physical objects. So the implication there is that traditional representation is not in fact abstract, it is the opposite, which is to say realistic. Abstract art explores the relationships of forms and colors, whereas more traditional art represents the world in recognizable images. So the implication there is that prior to the 20th century, artists did not explore the relationships of, for instance, forms and colors, which is totally ludicrous, right? Just so, going on. Here is one of the most famous illustrations of the modernist movement into abstraction, right? These are Matisse's Jeannette heads, and there's 5 of them. And basically what he did, I forget if Jeannette was a wife or a girlfriend or a patron, I don't remember which, but he starts here with a more naturalistic representation of Jeannette. And I'm using terms that are slightly problematic for me, but I'll add more clarity as we go. But more naturalistic, moving towards less naturalism, or more straightforward, moving towards less straightforward. And so, however, just to, if it's not already debunked for you, this idea of abstract art belonging to the 20th century only, let's look at the 5th Jeannette head, the one that's furthest from the literal reference to Jeannette's head. And let's compare it to an ancient Chinese sculpture from 5,000 years ago. And for me, they're very similar. Some of the particulars are very different, but in terms of the severity of the forms, or the strength of the shapes, or the severity of certain planes, all of these things are, they're sort of similar from one to the next. So the point here is that this idea of abstract art, it doesn't belong to just the 20th century. And so the big question is, what happens between ancient China 5,000 years ago and Matisse in the 20th century, and then even going forward. So these are a couple important points I want to make before we go forward, and I want you to think about these points I'm going to read to you in relationship to these definitions. Real, existing or occurring as fact. More importantly, actual rather than imaginary, ideal, or fictitious. Abstract, thought of apart from concrete realities, specific objects, or actual instances. So, in art, abstraction indicates a departure from reality, right, as this definition indicates. In representing subject matter, the departure from literal or actual object, or from the literal or actual object, can be slight, partial, or complete. Abstraction exists along a continuum. So one thing, if you accept my thesis that all art is abstract, which I haven't stated that yet, maybe I should have said that first. If you accept that thesis, then when you approach a work of art, or when you set out to make a work of art, the question becomes, where does this type of abstraction lie within the continuum of abstraction? And then you have to identify something about that work of art in order to determine that. We'll talk about what that is shortly. Even art that aims for verisimilitude of the highest degree can be said to be abstract, at least theoretically, since perfect representation is likely to be exceedingly elusive, not to mention the fact that the material actuality of the work and the subject are going to be necessarily different. So that, picture that sculpture of Voltaire in your mind, right? Which is very literalistic in its representation. If nothing else, you can't deny the fact that there's something unbelievably abstract, unbelievably apart from realities or actual instances, in the fact that the Voltaire sculpture is made out of stone, marble, and Voltaire's actual head is made out of other sorts of stuff. Total abstraction bears no trace of any reference to anything recognizable, to any naturalistic entity. So here, we're not going to go into this, but the question is there such a thing as total abstraction? Is there such a thing as a degree of abstraction that is so extreme that the work of art bears no trace of any reference to anything recognizable? Figuration and total abstraction are almost mutually exclusive. Almost. Notice I say almost. But figurative or representational art always contains some degree of abstraction. This is my point. All art is, to some degree, always abstract. It is the best artists who animate their subject/content through the abstract visual relationships that are inherent to the particular art form. I should have printed all this out and handed it to you to take home and think about, because this is very, this is dense. The main thesis, you can take that with you.